Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he gazed across the Pacific's endless expanse. The date was June 3, 1942, and the most ambitious naval operation in Japanese history was about to unfold. Yet beneath the surface of meticulous planning lay the seeds of catastrophic failure, seeds planted by the very confidence that had carried the Imperial Navy to victory after victory since Pearl Harbor. Taito's plan seemed flawless on paper. Operation MI would strike at Midway Atoll, that tiny speck of coral and sand that served as America's westernmost outpost in the Pacific. Yamamoto envisioned a crushing blow that would draw out the remnants of the United States Pacific Fleet, allowing his superior forces to annihilate them in decisive battle. With American naval power broken, Japan could dictate terms for peace from a position of unassailable strength. But the first critical error had already been made in the planning rooms of Tokyo months earlier. The Japanese command structure, riddled with inter-service rivalry and compartmentalized thinking, had failed to achieve true coordination. The Army and Navy operated as separate fiefdoms, each jealously guarding their intelligence and operational secrets. This institutional blindness would prove fatal when American codebreakers began unraveling Japanese communications. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had been working around the clock, their ears pressed to headphones as they intercepted and decoded Japanese radio traffic. The breakthrough came when they confirmed that AF, the mysterious target mentioned repeatedly in enemy transmissions, was indeed Midway. The Americans now possessed something invaluable: advanced knowledge of Japanese intentions. Yamamoto's second miscalculation stemmed from his success at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The surprise attack had been so devastatingly effective that it bred a dangerous overconfidence within the Japanese high command. They assumed their enemies remained stunned and demoralized, incapable of mounting an effective defense. This hubris blinded them to the remarkable resilience and adaptability of their American adversaries. The Japanese plan called for a complex, multi-pronged approach that would divide their forces across thousands of miles of ocean. While the main carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo approached Midway from the northwest, a separate invasion force would assault the Aleutian Islands far to the north. This northern operation, intended as a diversion, instead weakened the main assault by drawing away precious carriers and aircraft that would be desperately needed at Midway. As Yamamoto's massive fleet steamed eastward through the pre-dawn darkness, radio operators aboard American vessels were already intercepting their communications. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, had made a bold decision based on Rochefort's intelligence. Rather than dispersing his outnumbered forces to defend multiple targets, he would concentrate everything at Midway, lying in wait like a spider sensing vibrations in its web. The stage was set for one of history's most decisive naval battles, but the Japanese had already committed fatal errors that would doom their ambitious plans. Their overconfidence had blinded them to American capabilities, their divided command structure had compromised operational security, and their complex battle plan had scattered their strength when concentration was needed most. In the coming hours, these mistakes would exact a terrible price as the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled sailed unknowingly toward disaster. The pre-dawn hours of June 4, 1942, found Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton hunched over decoded intercepts in the basement intelligence center at Pearl Harbor. Steam rose from his coffee cup as he studied the latest Japanese communications, each decrypted message adding another piece to the tactical puzzle. What the Americans had achieved in the shadows would prove more decisive than any weapon in their arsenal. The intelligence coup that made Midway possible had begun months earlier when American cryptanalysts first cracked the Japanese Navy's operational code, designated JN-25 by Allied intelligence services. This breakthrough represented one of the war's most closely guarded secrets, known only to a handful of senior officers. Commander Rochefort's team had worked with dedication bordering on obsession, often sleeping at their desks as they unraveled the complex cipher systems protecting Japanese naval communications. According to historical accounts from the Naval Historical Center, the confirmation that Midway was the target came through an ingenious deception. When Japanese messages repeatedly mentioned an impending attack on AF, Rochefort's team arranged for Midway to transmit an uncoded message reporting problems with their water purification system. Within days, Japanese intelligence reported that AF was experiencing water shortage problems, confirming beyond doubt that Midway was their objective. This intelligence advantage gave Admiral Nimitz something no commander could buy with ships or planes: time to prepare. While Yamamoto's forces still sailed in apparent secrecy across the Pacific, American defenders were already positioning themselves for the coming battle. Task Forces 16 and 17, built around the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were rushing toward predetermined intercept positions northeast of Midway. The Japanese, meanwhile, remained completely unaware that their operational security had been compromised. Vice Admiral Nagumo's carrier striking force maintained strict radio silence as they approached their target, believing themselves invisible to American detection. This silence, intended to preserve the element of surprise, instead played directly into American hands by preventing Japanese commanders from receiving updated intelligence about enemy dispositions. The third major Japanese error was already manifesting in their battle plan's inflexibility. The operation called for Nagumo's carriers to launch two separate attacks, first against Midway's installations, then against any American naval forces that appeared. This sequential approach required careful timing and perfect execution, leaving no margin for the unexpected developments that define naval combat. As dawn approached, Nagumo's four carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, prepared to launch their first wave against Midway. These floating airfields represented the finest naval aviation force in the world, manned by pilots whose experience and skill were legendary throughout the Pacific. Yet they sailed toward battle hampered by a fundamental flaw in their tactical doctrine. The Japanese had never developed effective procedures for rapid aircraft rearming and refueling under combat conditions. American preparations, by contrast, reflected hard lessons learned from 6 months of war. Midway's defenders had used their advance warning to strengthen the atoll's defenses and position aircraft for maximum effectiveness. Marine Corps and Navy pilots prepared for battle, knowing they faced overwhelming odds, but also knowing that American intelligence had given them the greatest possible advantage. The communication networks linking Nimitz's scattered forces hummed, with encoded messages as final preparations took shape. Unlike their enemies, American commanders could coordinate their movements with real-time intelligence updates, adjusting their positions as new information arrived from codebreakers and reconnaissance aircraft. As the sun rose over the Central Pacific on June 4, 1942, the greatest carrier battle in history was about to begin. The Japanese approached with superior numbers and veteran crews, confident in their ability to crush any opposition. But they carried with them the weight of strategic errors that had already tilted the balance toward their enemies. The intelligence. War had been fought and lost before the first bomb fell, though Yamamoto's admirals remained blissfully unaware of their disadvantage. At 0430 hours on June 4, 1942, the first Japanese aircraft began lifting off from the pitching decks of Admiral Nagumo's carriers. 108 planes, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo aircraft formed up in the gray dawn light before turning southeast toward Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led this first wave, unaware that American radar operators were already tracking his formation's approach. The attack on Midway itself succeeded tactically but failed strategically, embodying the kind of limited thinking that plagued Japanese operations throughout the battle. Tominaga's bombers struck the atoll's facilities with devastating effect, destroying fuel storage tanks, hangars, and administrative buildings. Marines and sailors dove for cover as explosions rippled across the tiny island, while black smoke columns rose high into the tropical morning air. But Midway's defenders had used their advance warning well. Most of the atoll's aircraft had already launched to attack the approaching Japanese fleet, while anti-aircraft guns maintained fierce resistance from reinforced positions. When Tominaga radioed back to report that a second attack would be necessary to neutralize the base completely, he unknowingly triggered the most critical decision point of the entire battle. Admiral Nagumo faced a commander's nightmare. Incomplete information and mounting time pressure. His first wave had damaged but not destroyed Midway, while reconnaissance aircraft had failed to locate the American carriers that intelligence suggested might be in the area. Standing on Akagi's bridge, in his crisp white uniform, Nagumo made the decision that would doom the Japanese fleet. He ordered his second wave, originally armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for use against ships, to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a follow-up attack on Midway. This rearming process revealed a fatal flaw in Japanese carrier operations that had never been addressed despite months of combat experience. Unlike American carriers, which had developed efficient procedures for rapid ordnance changes, Japanese ships lacked the equipment and training for quick turnarounds. Under pressure, bombs and torpedoes cluttered the hangar decks as crews struggled to complete the changeover, creating a volatile situation that would soon prove catastrophic. The morning's confusion deepened when Scout Plane Number 4 from the cruiser Tone finally reported what everyone had feared: American ships to the northeast, including what appeared to be at least one carrier. This sighting, delayed by mechanical problems and poor communication procedures, arrived just as Nagumo's rearming operation reached its most vulnerable stage. Panic began to spread through the Japanese command structure as the implications became clear. The Americans were not only present in force, but had positioned themselves to attack while Japanese aircraft were returning from Midway, low on fuel and ammunition. Nagumo's carriers were caught at their most vulnerable moment, with planes crowded, on their hangar decks surrounded by live ordnance and aviation fuel. The fourth critical Japanese error now manifested: inadequate combat air patrol procedures. While American carriers maintained strong fighter coverage through careful rotation and positioning, the Japanese had launched most of their defensive fighters with the Midway strike force. Only a handful of Zeros remained to protect the four carriers, wholly insufficient against the massed American attack that was already forming up beyond the horizon. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, while Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie brought 34 more from Yorktown. These two squadrons represented the concentrated striking power of the American carrier force, guided toward their targets by the same intelligence network that had made the ambush possible. At 0920 hours, McCluskey's formation spotted. Smoke on the horizon, the Japanese carriers steaming in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft and fuel lines. The Americans had achieved what every naval aviator dreamed of: catching enemy carriers completely unprepared for attack. Below on the Japanese ships, organized chaos reigned as crews struggled to launch fighters and clear the vulnerable ordnance from their hangar decks. Months of training and preparation had not anticipated this scenario, being caught between operations with no time to properly organize defenses. The morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific as American dive bombers began their attack runs, but the battle's outcome had already been determined by Japanese errors in intelligence, planning, and execution. The most powerful carrier force in naval history was about to pay the ultimate price for its commanders' miscalculations. At 0925 hours on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed his Dauntless dive bomber into a 70-degree descent toward the Japanese carrier Kaga. 2 miles below, frantic crews scrambled across the carrier's deck, desperately trying to launch fighters as American aircraft screamed down from the morning sky. The next 6 minutes would decide the fate of the Pacific War. The Japanese carriers presented perfect targets, caught in the vulnerable transition between offensive and defensive operations. Bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines cluttered their hangar decks, the result of Nagumo's hasty decision to rearm his aircraft for a second strike on Midway. What should have been orderly combat operations had devolved into dangerous improvisation, creating conditions that would turn minor hits into catastrophic explosions. McCluskey's first bomb struck Kaga near the island superstructure, penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among stored ordnance. The explosion triggered a chain reaction as aviation fuel ignited and spread across the crowded space. Within seconds, the proud carrier transformed from a floating airfield into a blazing funeral pyre, her crew trapped by walls of flame that made escape impossible for hundreds of sailors. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron from Yorktown targeted the carrier Soryu. Leslie's own bomb release mechanism had malfunctioned during the approach, forcing him to make his attack run without weapons, but his wingmen pressed home their assault with devastating accuracy. 3 direct hits in rapid succession gutted Soryu's flight deck and hangar spaces, turning another of Japan's premier carriers into a blazing wreck. The third victim was Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship and the pride of the Japanese carrier fleet. Lieutenant Richard Best led a 3-plane section in a precision attack that placed 1,000-pound bomb directly amidships. The explosion ruptured fuel lines and ignited ordnance stored throughout the ship, creating an inferno that quickly spread beyond any hope of control. According to accounts preserved in the Naval War College archives, the scene aboard these stricken vessels defied comprehension. Sailors emerged from below decks with their clothing ablaze, diving into the Pacific rather than face the approaching flames. Officers who had planned Japan's greatest naval victory found themselves ordering abandonment of ships that had seemed invincible just minutes earlier. Only Hiryu, positioned several miles away from her sister carriers, escaped the initial American onslaught. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding from Hiryu's bridge, watched in horror as 3/4 of his striking force disappeared in smoke and flame. The sight that greeted him defied everything Japanese naval doctrine had taught about carrier, operations, and survivability. The speed of the destruction revealed another critical Japanese error: inadequate damage control procedures compared to American standards. Where American carriers featured sophisticated firefighting systems and compartmentalization designed to contain battle damage, Japanese ships prioritized offensive capability over survivability. This design philosophy, which had seemed logical during their string of early victories, now proved fatally flawed when facing sustained enemy attack. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier, found himself trapped aboard the burning Akagi as explosions rocked the ship around him. The irony was not lost on this veteran aviator. The same tactical surprise that had served Japan so well at Pearl Harbor was now being used against them with equally devastating effect. Nagumo himself barely escaped as Akagi's bridge became untenable. The admiral who had commanded the most powerful carrier force in naval history was forced to transfer his flag to a destroyer, watching helplessly as his fleet dissolved in flames and smoke. The psychological impact of this reversal would haunt Japanese naval operations for the remainder of the war. By 0931 hours, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were burning wrecks, their aircraft and experienced aircrew lost. Forever, the battle was far from over. Hiryu still posed a dangerous threat, and Japanese surface forces retained formidable firepower. But the strategic initiative had shifted irrevocably to the Americans. The fatal minutes of June 4th had demonstrated that naval warfare's fundamental nature had changed. Surprise intelligence and tactical flexibility now mattered more than raw firepower or individual heroism. The Japanese had learned this lesson in the most painful way possible, watching their maritime empire's foundation crumble in less time than it takes to brew morning coffee. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood on Hiryu's bridge at 1000 hours on June 4, 1940. 2. Surveying a scene that would have been unimaginable at dawn. 3 pillars of black smoke marked the funeral pyres of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the backbone of Japan's carrier fleet reduced to burning hulks drifting powerless across the Pacific. As the sole surviving flat top of Nagumo's once mighty force, Hiryu represented Japan's last hope of salvaging something from the disaster. Yamaguchi, known throughout the Imperial Navy for his aggressive tactical thinking and unshakable composure, under pressure, faced an impossible situation. His single carrier confronted at least 2 undamaged American flat tops, supported by their full complement of aircraft and screening vessels. Any rational commander would have withdrawn to preserve his remaining strength, but withdrawal meant conceding defeat in what was supposed to be Japan's greatest naval victory. The admiral made a decision that embodied both the best and worst of Japanese naval tradition. Rather than retreat, Hiryu would attack with everything she had, seeking to inflict maximum damage on the American fleet before suffering the inevitable consequences. This choice reflected the same offensive spirit that had carried Japan to early war victories, but also the inflexibility that had contributed to the morning's catastrophe. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters off Hiryu's deck at 10:58 hours, their mission to locate and destroy American carriers before they could launch additional strikes. These pilots represented some of Japan's finest naval aviators, veterans of campaigns from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, flying with the desperate courage of men who knew their nation's fate hung in the balance. The Americans, meanwhile, had learned from their morning success and maintained strong combat air patrols around their task forces. When Kobayashi's formation approached Yorktown at approximately 1200 hours, they faced a gauntlet of Wildcat fighters and anti-aircraft fire that decimated their ranks. Only a handful of Japanese aircraft survived to make their attack runs, though they managed to score 3 bomb hits on Yorktown before being destroyed or driven off. Yorktown's damage, while serious, demonstrated American superiority in damage control procedures that had been developed through hard experience. Repair teams sealed compartments, controlled flooding, and restored power with an efficiency that impressed even enemy observers. Within 2 hours, the carrier was making 20 knots and operating aircraft, a recovery that would have been impossible aboard a Japanese vessel with similar damage. Yamaguchi's second strike, launched at 1330 hours, consisted of 10 torpedo planes and 6 fighters under Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same officer who had led the morning attack on Midway. This formation faced even stiffer resistance than the first, with American fighters and anti-aircraft guns coordinating their defense through improved communication procedures learned during 6 months of Pacific combat. Historical records from the Naval Historical Foundation indicate that Tominaga's attack achieved 2 torpedo hits on Yorktown, causing severe flooding and forcing her crew to abandon ship temporarily. However, this tactical success came at a devastating cost. Virtually every Japanese aircraft in the strike was shot down, eliminating Hiryu's remaining offensive capability. The American response came swiftly and decisively. Enterprise launched 24 dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher at 1530 hours, guided toward Hiryu by scout planes that had located the last Japanese carrier. Unlike the morning's attack, which had benefited from surprise, this strike faced determined fighter opposition and heavy anti-aircraft fire. Nevertheless, American pilots pressed home their assault with the same precision that had destroyed the other Japanese carriers. 4 direct bomb hits transformed Hiryu into another blazing wreck, her flight deck buckled, and her hangar spaces filled with flame and smoke. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship, standing at attention on the bridge as explosions rocked the dying carrier around him. By 1800 hours on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers lay dead in the water, their aircraft and irreplaceable aircrew lost forever. The Imperial Navy had suffered its most devastating defeat since the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, with consequences that would reverberate throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The destruction of Hiryu marked more than just the end of a battle. It represented the collapse of Japanese naval aviation as an offensive force capable of decisive action. The pilots and aircraft lost at Midway could not be replaced quickly enough to maintain Japan's earlier momentum, shifting the strategic balance irreversibly toward the United States and its allies. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the devastating reports aboard his flagship Yamato at 2100 hours on June 4, 1942. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew dead, and Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific crippled, all within a single day of combat. The architect of Pearl Harbor sat in stunned silence as the magnitude of the disaster became clear, realizing that his gamble to force American capitulation had instead guaranteed a prolonged war Japan could not win. The immediate tactical situation was hopeless, but Yamamoto briefly considered pressing forward with his surface fleet to bombard Midway and salvage something from the operation. His battleships and cruisers still possessed overwhelming firepower compared to anything the Americans could deploy, and the warrior code demanded that honor be preserved through continued fighting. However, cold strategic reality ultimately prevailed over romantic notions of glorious defeat. Without air cover, Yamamoto's surface vessels would be sitting targets for American land-based aircraft operating from Midway and Hawaiian bases. The submarine threat alone made such an approach suicidal, while the loss of reconnaissance capabilities meant advancing blind into enemy-controlled waters. At 0255 hours on June 5th, the combined fleet received orders to withdraw westward, abandoning the Midway operation and beginning Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. the human cost of Japanese command failures at Midway extended far beyond simple casualty figures. An entire generation of naval aviators, men who had trained for years to master carrier operations, perished in the space of a few hours. These pilots represented an investment in time, resources, and expertise that Japan's wartime economy could never replace. Their loss created a qualitative decline in Japanese naval aviation that would handicap operations for the remainder of the war. The strategic implications were equally devastating. Japan's carrier fleet had been the primary instrument of her Pacific expansion, providing mobile air power that could project force across vast oceanic distances. With 4 fleet carriers destroyed and their aircrew lost, the Imperial Navy's offensive capability was reduced to defensive operations and limited attacks that could no longer achieve decisive results. American industrial capacity, already mobilizing for total war production, would soon tip the quantitative balance even further against Japan. While Yamamoto struggled to replace his lost carriers with converted merchant vessels and hastily trained pilots, American shipyards were launching new Essex-class carriers with regularity that bordered on the miraculous. The naval balance that had seemed so favorable to Japan in December 1941 was shifting inexorably toward her enemies. According to analysis from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after the war, Midway marked the point where Japanese strategic options became permanently limited. The dream of forcing American acceptance of Japanese hegemony in the Western Pacific died with the carriers burning off Midway, replaced by the grim reality of fighting a defensive war against enemies with superior resources and industrial capacity. The psychological impact on Japanese naval leadership proved as damaging as the material losses. Officers who had grown accustomed to victory and tactical superiority now faced the sobering reality that American forces could outfight them under equal conditions. The aura of invincibility that had sustained Japanese expansion since Pearl Harbor was shattered, replaced by growing awareness that ultimate victory was no longer achievable. Emperor Hirohito received news of the defeat in his palace study, his normally impassive features betraying shock at the scope of the disaster. The man who had approved the decision for war now faced the consequences of strategic overreach and tactical inflexibility that had characterized Japanese military planning from the beginning of the conflict. The Battle of Midway ended on June 6, 1942, when the last Japanese vessels disappeared over the western horizon, leaving 4 carrier wrecks and thousands of bodies floating in the Pacific swells. What had begun as Japan's most ambitious naval operation concluded as her most catastrophic defeat, the result of intelligence failures, tactical rigidity, and strategic miscalculations that doomed the operation before the first shot was fired. The errors that destroyed Japanese hopes at Midway, overconfidence, poor coordination, inflexible planning, and underestimation of enemy capabilities, would plague Imperial forces throughout the remainder of the war. June 4, 1942, marked not just a tactical defeat, but the beginning of Japan's inevitable slide toward ultimate capitulation, as the consequences of command failures cascaded through every subsequent Pacific campaign until surrender finally came in talk.